Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar, Systemic Racism, Disasters Expose It, How Do We Address It? I'm Tanya Gulliver-Garcia, Director of Learning and Partnerships at CDP, and I co-coordinate our racism and intersectional equity work here. This webinar is co-sponsored by ABFI, Change Philanthropy, the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, Native Americans in Philanthropy, the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, and the United Philanthropy Forum. Some reminders before we get started. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website and our YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. You can access Zoom-created captions today using the CC button at the bottom of your screen, but we will have more accurate captions in the recording. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box, and we will answer them at the end of the panel presentation. And if you're on Twitter, please use the hashtag CDP4Recovery to share and join the discussion. CDP starts all webinars now with a land acknowledgement to recognize the original stewards of the land where we live and work. I've spent most of my life in Treaty 13 territory, known in English as Toronto, Ontario. That land is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I now split my time between Bulbancha, the land of many tongues, also known as New Orleans, Louisiana, and Grand Blanc, Michigan, where I am today. Grand Blanc is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples, and is located on land ceded in the 1807 Treaty of Detroit. CDP acknowledges that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from the land, not just by natural or environmental disasters, but by the socio-economic and cultural disaster of colonialism. Despite centuries of theft and violence, this still and always will be Indigenous land. Indigenous peoples are still here today, demonstrating innumerable talents and gifts amid continued oppression and colonialism. We honor the elders, past and present, as well as future generations. Miigwech. Dr. Kathleen Tierney says, disasters are often depicted as great levelers, victimizing rich and poor alike. But the effects of disasters on populations are anything but random. This is very true. Natural hazards can occur in all types of communities and affect all sorts of people. But in every recent disaster, those who had access to resources were immediately better off than those who did not. They were better situated to evacuate ahead of time. They were more likely to have the funds and insurance to rebuild their homes. And that access to resources stems from pre-existing disaster conditions and situations such as poverty, employment status, race, ethnicity, sex, gender, sexual orientation, disability, language access, home ownership, family composition, age, citizenship, many more. It's in the everyday living conditions that expose people to physical hazards and result in the increased negative impacts of disaster events at the socio-economic, political, and psychological levels. And within that list of disparities, we at CDP call out racial equity because the historical disinvestment in Black, Indigenous, people of color communities is the underlying issue at the source of challenges and dangers they face in the US and in many areas of the world. The Racial Equity Institute in North Carolina calls this the groundwater approach. They say that in every area, even when adjusted for other variables, race is the underlying issue leading to disparities. You can think of it like this. Too often we respond by looking at the problems of a fish in a lake and blame the people, or the fish, for their issues. It's an individual situation. At best, we might start looking at the lake itself and wonder if it might be polluted. But if every lake is polluted, education or employment, then we need to recognize that it's a groundwater level problem. And that's what racism is. If we only focus on the fish or the lakes, we ignore the fact the complete system is poisoned. There are so many examples that we can pull out in addition to race that people are affected in with disasters, and I want to highlight a few. But it's important to remember that it is the intersection of race with these that cause even more disruption and problems in recovery. People with disabilities are at increased risk of morbidity and mortality during a disaster. After the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, researchers found that the fatality rate for people with disabilities was 2 to 4 times higher than the general population. We know that at least 25 to 40% of homeless youth are members of the LGBTQ+ community. And this means that their access to preparedness and emergency information is reduced. They may lack the means to evacuate. They may find it difficult to find safe shelter. And they may find it difficult to obtain housing after a disaster, as prices typically increase and their incomes are very low. According to the Brookings Institution, the average length of displacement for a refugee is between 10 and 26 years. And this occurs when the causes of displacement have not been addressed, conflict and human rights abuses persist, or the conditions at home do not allow for return. But at the same time, host and third countries are reluctant to provide full rights to the refugees. And so better solutions are required to more efficiently and quickly move people out of refugee status. And even FEMA's own National Advisory Council has issued a report that rebukes the organization for its failure to address systemic racial discrimination that has resulted in BIPOC communities losing wealth after a disaster. In contrast, white communities typically gain wealth. And FEMA's pre-disaster starting point goal, only returning people back to where they started, is a significant component of this widening gap. And now I would love to introduce the panel members who are joining us today. And I'm so excited to be here speaking with them, and I look forward to the information that they're going to share. Dr. Cassandra R. Davis is a research professor in the Department of Public Policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on the environmental disruptions to schooling, specifically the impact of natural disasters on low-income communities of color. Dr. Davis's goal is to support educators, community leaders, and policymakers to improve responses, preparedness, and recovery in areas with the highest need. Carla Lopez Del Rio is the Associate Director of the Center for Social Innovation, Census Legacies. She has helped forge many partnerships among public, private, and grassroots organizations, leading to increased civic engagement, innovative community-led projects, and affordable housing solutions. Prior to joining CSI, Carla served as the U.S. Census Bureau's lead partnership specialist for Riverside County. And for over a decade, Carla dedicated her passion and career to affordable housing, homeownership, and community development. And Flozell Daniels Jr. is joining us from the disaster hit zone this week of New Orleans. He's a New Orleans native and a public policy and community engagement strategist with expertise in deep equity models that support community development, resilience building, legislative strategy, and leadership development. Professionally, Flozell is president and CEO of the Foundation for Louisiana, and in his civic capacity, he's chairman of the New Orleans Regional Transit Authority and Orleans Public Education Network, board member emeritus of the Urban League of Louisiana, and serves on both the Louisiana Public Defender Board and the Governor's Climate Task Force. So welcome, everyone. And Cassandra, let's get started with you. Why is it important to talk about the context and the historical implications of race in determining how to identify problems and solutions?
Well, hello, and thank you so much for bringing me to this great space. It's such an important topic, and I'm just thrilled to be with this panel of very knowledgeable people. So yeah, let's absolutely get started. So the perspective that I really, kind of my foundation in looking at different instances is really understanding the social context as well as the historical context of things that are going on. Particularly when I look at disasters or natural hazards, I really like to use the theory critical race theory. It's actually under a little bit of it's a little bit of a risque topic or theory to even talk about. An article was actually just released today talking about how it really addresses racism. But in short, critical race theory looks at, there's a tenet that's called whiteness as property. And it basically suggests that whiteness as property follows the belief of power and exclusion, where that privilege in the US has a strong association with property rights. So in short, whiteness as property stipulates that both being white and owning property share a common principle where power is maintained in legally excluding the other. So when we think about historically, people of color have been prevented from owning land or quality land. We have instances of slavery in our country, our Indian Removal Act, Chinese Exclusionary Act, Homeowners Loan Act, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill, just to name a few of instances where people of color were prevented or removed from land or prevented from even having quality land. We see within our research that people of color receive, like I said, low quality resources based on where they live. So that's looking at schools, utilities, access to food and health. A study out of the Equity and Transformation in 2018, they showed that Black and Brown students are more likely to attend crowded schools, have less access to higher levels of science and math, and are taught by teachers with lower qualifications as compared to their white peers. We also see that there's little to no generational wealth and mobility for families of color. This idea that if you work really hard, you should excel. Well, that's a myth. Darity and colleagues in 2018 also created this report where they showed that Black households with a college-educated head had less wealth than a white family whose head didn't even complete high school. So next slide, please. We see these great kind of historical examples. I am located in North Carolina, and we have a community that has been known to be one of the oldest African-American developments or communities within the US. It was purchased by a group of newly freed slaves. It was the cheap, swampy land. It was the land that they were allowed, and I'm doing air quotes so you can't see me, but they were allowed to purchase. Unfortunately, this land gets hit by repeated floods and hurricanes each year. Even kind of thinking about Chinese immigrants in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, we saw that their numbers of death based on from that earthquake alone, they weren't even counted in the original numbers of mortality because they weren't considered citizens, they were considered beings. Just really kind of going on and talking about how natural hazards exacerbates pre-existing conditions, meaning that if you're doing great, a disaster will help boost you, will help boost your economy. But if your economy is not doing well, the opposite will happen. And finally, really as local damages increase, so does wealth inequality by race, education, and home ownership. This was a recent article that came out in 2019 that really talked about how, especially as FEMA was providing resources to communities, they found that larger wealth gaps emerged.
Yeah, that's also tied to that report that FEMA just released, their National Advisory Council.
Yeah.
Cassandra, when we were talking before the webinar, we talked about this concept of vulnerable populations, and that's something that CDP has been trying to work through. It's a term we've used for a while, but are increasingly uncomfortable with. So how do you think about vulnerability?
Yeah, no, that's also a great question. I really like this question. So we have within my latest report that we're working on, we are deciding not to use the term at all. As you can see on your screen, there's these kind of faded cookie cutter images. It's this idea that they're very kind of cookie cutter terms. Vulnerability, from our perspective, it does not consider the historical and the social factors that disproportionately impact recovery for groups. In fact, it suggests a very static state. It denotes weakness. It creates this kind of sense of a vulnerable population needs a person or a group of people to save them. It doesn't see them as assets, as active members, as people with agency. So instead, we've decided to use socially marginalized or underrepresented in its place. These terms, stakeholders have a clear assessment of the burden, the stress, the indirect effects of natural hazards on subgroups. Next slide, please. In addition to that, really kind of interested in looking at the intersectionality of different groups of people that are impacted by events. So we could see that a household, a child that is living in a low-income household in rural Kentucky, impacted by a major flood, and the types of responses and how they're able to recover is completely different from a migrant family that's living in a place in California that's been impacted by fires or by an earthquake. And so really understanding that this cookie cutter image of how a person is responding or how they are kind of given or dealing with an event, it changes drastically. And that it's not just how women experience it, it might be how a woman who is from an Indigenous community that is living with multi-generational household, and they might be far away from their working conditions, experiences it completely different from somebody who has not all of those aspects. So I guess in short, stepping away from this term in terms of vulnerability, that vulnerability is not a vulnerable person, it's not a noun. The word vulnerable is not a noun, and really looking to that individual and how to best meet that individual's need given their circumstance.
Yeah, that's really important. I think our position has been moving towards populations made vulnerable, and recognizing those sectors and descriptors you described.
Right.
So you've studied the impact of Hurricanes Matthew and Harvey and the educational system. And I'm curious what you learned about disasters' impact on education, and including both the students and the educators.
Yep. So we it really kind of started after Hurricane Matthew, and Hurricane Matthew that hit in 2016 in North Carolina. We noticed that something that I noticed, especially working in the Department of Public Policy, I work with a lot of administrators, political type figures, and I was very aware of the areas that had been impacted by Matthew. So I wanted to know kind of how, to the extent that schools are able to recover from storms, especially when North Carolina and other regions are repeatedly hit. We found out that there was little to no information for these schools that were largely in high poverty type communities. And so we set out to to interview educators, to administer a survey with educators, and just getting a sense of their story and how they see what type of needs that they need to recover, as well as what were their supports, what were things that were missing and ways to improve. So this question is actually pulled from a first survey that we administered back in 2017. We had about 1,500 responses across 10 districts. And so we just asked them a simple question of what type of supports were provided to students and school personnel following Hurricane Matthew. What we found is that the difference in the things that were provided to students versus things that were provided to the actual personnel, which was just a little shocking. We talk about how hazards will impact communities, and yet we saw that far more kind of resources and supports went straight to the students, opposed to being kind of shared in these spaces. I think next slide. I feel like I could talk about this all day, and I'm trying to be mindful of our two other amazing panelists. Also, some things that I've been asked about kind of major connections between hurricanes and COVID-19. It's not funny, but a year ago, I had colleagues saying disasters in schools, like that's not a thing. And now we are in COVID-19, this major, this hurricane that doesn't seem to end, this global pandemic. And so some things that I found, or some things that I pulled from a few of my studies that looked at hurricanes in schools environments, the idea that there's this continuation of stress, and that there's immediate and lingering stressors, Also, that the mental health ripple effects on academics, the way that we are stressed out and feeling, that impacts our academics, our behavior, as well as our attendance. And that goes for students and for their educators. But also what was missing, mental health providers. Some lessons learned, providing counseling services to everyone and kind of nonstop, and then be responsible to the needs of educators and students. Those are kind of very high level perspectives, but absolutely things that we can see in terms of what has happened and what is happening currently right now.
Thanks, Cassandra. Really good information. Carla, I'm going to turn to you next. And I know you have several slides, so I want to reassure our audience that the slides will be provided after. So if Carla is going really fast through them, it's just so we can get all of the panel and the Q&A in, and you will have a chance to look at them in detail later. So we met in a webinar discussion about Census Legacies. Can you talk a little bit about that project and what kind of impact it could have for disasters?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. I am extremely excited about talking about this. I just want to say a little bit, I know we have to go really fast, but I want to say that I don't know if I can call myself a survivor, but I was a very little kid in the 1985 earthquake in Mexico City, one of the deadliest we've ever had. I still have memories. I try not to tear up, but it is impactful. It is only community can come together to the government, and the response of the emergency services can I'm sure a lot of people here know this, right? It's just people will not come to your rescue. It really, you depend on your neighbors, and I learned that from that experience. So extremely happy to be here and to contribute whatever I can to be better prepared for the future, particularly for people who Dr. Cassandra, I'm sorry, I'm going to say underrepresented. I will get used to the next, but we're moving into trusted messengers. So let me tell you a little bit about Census Legacies. It is a fast growing network of funders, nonprofits, businesses, government agencies, and census coalitions from across the country seeking to repurpose the Census Outreach tables to ensure that historically undercounted communities, and that's what the Census Bureau calls them, undercounted, we call them underrepresented, have an equal voice in shaping the future of our communities. Census tables were some of the most inclusive outreach efforts we've ever have undertaken in the US, particularly by the US Census Bureau. Thousands of tables across the country have gathered the leadership of some of the most trusted messengers of these underrepresented members of our society. And some offer huge capital and enormous potential for collaborations and equity work. In supporting localities to retain their growth of their census outreach partnerships and not lose that momentum, we plan to provide technical assistance and support so they can be stronger moving forward. But it is our intention to encourage them to make disaster planning part of their understanding, particularly as we go through this pandemic together and we learn together. So in the next slide, I just want to give you a very quick glimpse at the type of advisory group that is forming behind Census Legacies. We are heading into our first year, and you will see that philanthropy, nonprofits, governments that are local, national, business associations, census advocates, all of us are coming together to see how we can move from census outreach into other issues that affect the community without losing all of that leadership and that social capital. In the next slide, you will see that we have 3 key insights from the census outreach at Census Legacies. We believe the very most important one is trusted messengers are essential to delivering a higher count. And when it comes to disaster response, they are the ones that will respond alongside their communities and mobilize them. Community input needs to be all-inclusive. This was extremely helpful, particularly in addressing the issues of intersectional work for communities LGBTQ, people with disabilities. What we've mentioned before here in the call was the homeless youth who are LGBTQ. When you have the leadership, and this is happening actually here at the local Tri-County Community Partnership that I'll share in a minute, where we are repurposing our table. We do have the leadership of our housing authorities, housing advocates, LGBTQ, local advocates, and serving organizations, and they are working on these issues, having those conversations offline and online. It's extremely helpful and efficient. And then the co-design of solutions, of course, this is to tell us all that as we bring all of this leadership together, co-designing is much stronger because you are able to cover the blind spots, able to project better, leverage, and dream together and move together, motivate each other. It's this momentum that you gather when you co-design than when you're not co-designing. On the next slide, I would like to tell you a little bit about why Census Legacies came about. And it's because every 10 years, we build these tables together and then we disband them. And you see that happening not just with census, you see it happening with voter registration. You see it happen. You see it happening in many different areas of our civic engagement. So we came up in the next slide. You will see the definition that's coming out of all of this interaction, and that is the definition of the civic infrastructure. Trusted messengers are able to address the issues of intersectionality within this framework. We are seeing that that civic infrastructure is all of the organizational structures, networks, and partnerships necessary for a well-functioning society. And we think about, roads and bridges as infrastructure. Well, you need people connectivity as well. So if we go to the next slide, you will see that connectivity is one of the most important components of our infrastructure. And the connectivity has to happen between interagencies, right? We need coordination, and that's very normal for disaster relief, but we also need community media. Legacy media actually does not reach some of the most underserved communities. Community media is one of them, and I'll talk a little bit about that if we have some time. Faith-based organizations, and I'll talk a little bit about how when they get involved with vaccination, it makes a huge difference in fighting vaccine hesitancy and actually delivering vaccines. Nonprofits, corporate social responsibility to the community involving the businesses is extremely important. Schools, libraries, universities, and philanthropy and other civil society actors. So there are many of us that make part of this civic infrastructure. In the next slide, we will talk about connectivity. It's not just being connected, it's being connected in a certain way and with certain values. So trust is one of the most important pieces and values of this connectivity within the civic infrastructure framework. Information sharing, relationship building, learning, and persuasion, particularly when it comes to issues about equity and logistical challenges. Peer-to-peer learning is extremely helpful for many of our partners. And then the continuum of governance. We want people to be part of governing. We understand governing beyond just having elected officials. We believe governance happens in partnership with elected officials and city staff and all the other civic infrastructure partners. And then in the next slide, I just wanted to talk about a little bit about examples, but I think Tanya had a question.
Yeah, I think, when we talked, you shared with me that how some of these census tables, census groups were then moving into things like vaccination and COVID response. So can you give us a couple examples about that?
Absolutely. So we have several examples that are promising here in this list, and I encourage you to follow what happens with each locality. One example I'll give you that inspired me so much was the Fair Count in Georgia. Fair Count actually is using the infrastructure they created with the Census Outreach. And what they did is they put hotspots in barbershops. So particularly in Black communities, African-American communities. so that they would be able to provide the connectivity that they needed for the self-response, which was, historically online by the Census Bureau for the first time. So that type of thinking and that type of co-design is so inspiring, but also learning about it, that peer learning is so valuable. I want to tell you about the Tri-County Community Partnership that came out of the census here at Riverside, San Bernardino, and Imperial. This is a California-based demonstration project of how to move into disaster or emergency response. These 3 counties are some of the largest. Actually, I think Riverside is the fastest growing region in the entire nation when it comes to counties growth. Together, they make up something similar to the state. These 3 counties make up something similar to the size of the state of South Carolina, both in geography and in population. So we have, and we also count, California is extremely diverse. We have from farm workers to Indigenous people, warehouse workers. I mean, it's extremely diverse. We have more than, hundreds of languages spoken. And in order for us to address vaccinations, we came together, we stayed together after the census. We came as a group, continued the work on census, but also worked on COVID response, which something we have seen empirically throughout the nation. But then we moved into vaccine equity. And for the Tri-County Community Partnership, it meant having the 3 county health public officials on the line on a Zoom call, also having the community media that have some of the most remote radio stations in the area, print advertisement in so many different languages, and community partners. When we asked the government, how can we help you be more equitable in the distribution of vaccines, because we are seeing on the maps that they are not going to these communities, they asked us to help them connect to the faith-based organizations. And the reason why is because they had seen how when they held the vaccine pop-ups at their localities and they invited people, they would get maybe 60 people. When they partnered with the local church, attendance was over 300, and they asked for a second and third day to bring more people. So that power of people and connectivity is so promising from this Census Legacies work. On the next slide, go ahead, Tanya.
No, I mean, I think it ties in, but thinking about how this connects to disasters, but also to racial equity, which I know is something you've talked about and thought about a lot.
Of course. So we, when it comes to racial equity and enhancing really what's happening on the ground, one of the most beautiful things, as I mentioned, in Mexico, I don't know that we have such a robust FEMA and VOAD, all of these volunteer organizations and people organized and ready to respond. But in addition to that, we believe that Census Legacies brings an enhancement to these infrastructure. We believe that long-term relationships on the ground will improve the communication among those trusted messengers that I mentioned, and will make the messaging more efficient as we go into any type of disaster, because they will happen. Unfortunately, we cannot plan our future without them. And then we, community-based organizations could really leverage volunteer efforts with other local resources, such as funding, community, social capital, including more volunteers and staff. In the next slide, I also just wanted to say that equity in disaster preparedness is a proactive, not a reactive planning tool. We are trying to be as equitable as we can with all the funding that's coming for the vaccinations and the COVID response, but it has not been embedded into our culture, has not been embedded into our operations, into the way that we partner. So that's what we are seeking to do. We are seeking to think about in the future how equity would work and who would need to be sitting at the table, what type of communication would need to happen, in really addressing the needs that and the challenges and the opportunities that the disasters brings, because they do bring some opportunities. People do take action, and people do think critically and also innovatively in disasters. So we need to capture that good too. So equity needs to be part of the design, not just the implementation, and it requires short-term and long-term commitment. And there, we can talk more about different strategies that show equity, but I think that it was a little self-evident with some of the examples I gave a little bit ago. So happy to answer more questions.
Thank you, Carla. Flozell, I'm going to move to you, but I want to remind our audience that after Flozell, the panel will be answering questions. So please do put your questions into the Q&A box. I see there's some there already. So Flozell, you and I both live in New Orleans, and we know from data that Black people have gotten poorer, white people have gotten wealthier since Katrina, which, believe it or not, is almost 16 years ago this August. And that all sorts of other data markers come into play, like education, incarceration, unemployment. Your organization was founded in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. So thinking back, what could funders have done differently back in 2005 in the immediate aftermath? And what can they continue to do now since there's still a need for support?
Great, thanks, Tanya. I'm really glad to be here with you and these esteemed panelists and the amazing audience that we have with us today. As you mentioned, Foundation for Louisiana was originally created as the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation. And the founders understood it was important to mount an equitable and inclusive response to Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. They really understood that that response needed to do a few important things, right? One, have an analysis that recognizes that the disasters of structural racism, gender bias, racialized land use and zoning and resource allocation schemes, actual divestments from Black and Indigenous and persons of color communities and LGBTQ communities. As a matter of public policies, these disasters hit our shores long before Katrina did. And if we didn't address them in the context of the work, the opportunity would be missed. And so the answer to your question is a bit mixed because some funders actually got it and some didn't. Some funders really understood that they had to focus their investments on building community-based infrastructure, investing in people's ability to organize, for instance, at the neighborhood level and inside of categories that matter, particularly housing, great jobs, and some of the recovery decisions. Others understood the need to develop new equity-grounded analyses by way of ethical research, and we can come back to what ethical research means in the disaster context, and data reports that both told important truths about why our communities were so vulnerable to the onslaught of climate change and bad policy. And other funders supported the critically important work of leadership development, particularly of people who were here before the storms to ensure that the generational recovery we typically assume in the context of a catastrophe, a 15 to 20-year recovery process. And that assuming that in that generational recovery, that it could be led by folks who are deeply embedded in those communities and have already invested in them before disaster happened. Additionally, we know for a fact that funders needed to invest in safe, affordable, energy efficient housing options and to support entrepreneurs of color to make a difference and stoke more resilience in communities. Again, I mention all of this because the real answer is that some funders really understood this and some of the things that my fellow panelists have also mentioned. And we continue to know that these lessons are enduring. Some funders did stick to more traditional approaches and they missed the chance to respond, unfortunately, and I believe unwittingly, adding to long entrenched inequities and imbalances of power by ensuring that both recovery dollars on the public side as well as philanthropic resources benefited already wealthy communities and powerful people, and that the chance for reform in some areas was actually diminished and tainted by minimizing democratic opportunities for that work to be informed by both the experience and the brilliance of community wisdom. So overwhelmingly, these ineffective actions and investments were deeply racialized and ended up further marginalizing Black and Indigenous and persons of color and women. And I can answer more about some of the details, but it is really important to acknowledge that frequently in a post-disaster environment, and Tanya, you and I have talked about this before in other panels, there is an urgency, and that urgency actually undermines a racial equity agenda. And so we really do have to have some conversation, I think, about what role that plays and how it ends up setting us up for failure. And so funders really should continue to support the fundamentals, particularly as it relates to structural racism and how it shows up in the disaster context. And for us, that's leadership development and Black and Indigenous and persons of color communities and allied communities and LGBTQ communities, especially where they're focused on upending structural racism and affecting positive and affirmative policy change. We also know for a fact that funders have to continue to support wealth building strategies. That remains a critical investment because the racial and gender wealth gaps continue to grow, as we know from the data. And I cannot overemphasize how important it is for funders to support organizations that are utilizing public engagement and who are expanding civic power through policy change, increasing voter engagement, and holding public and private actors accountable to best practice through a deep racial equity lens. That work is critical. And last, where possible, we found through experience that when philanthropy can use its power and position to put its own shoulder to the door of justice and transformation with community, I would add led by community, we're much likelier to get the kind of outcomes that we're looking to get. So in addition to making the investments, in addition to honoring and recognizing the power dynamic, philanthropy has to show up as an active partner in these justice and transformation discussions in the disaster response context so that we can really help community close these gaps.
Thanks, Flozell. And I think this next question, with some of the work that FFL has done with LA Safe, really ties into that. So Louisiana last year, 7 or 8 times in the cone of uncertainty, 5 cyclones making landfall. You've had 3 or 4 days of storms, a couple of tornadoes this week. I know you've been without power. Now there's a boil water advisory. It just doesn't seem to end. So how can funders address these issues of climate justice? Because obviously there's a link here to climate change, but in ways that make sure no one is left out of that discussion. Yeah,
it's really been an important set of lessons for us since Katrina. When Katrina happened, it felt like nationally, folks felt like and said to us, well, this doesn't happen where I live. And what we said at the time was the science was telling us very clearly, and it told us before Katrina, that it was in fact happening, emerging, and would expand. And we would see what would happen with Hurricane Sandy. We would see some of the other issues that have emerged in the last 15 plus years. And so this is a conversation for the entire world to be having, particularly in the context of climate change and its inequitable and sort of inordinate impact on Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities of color writ large, and certainly, as was mentioned earlier, also low-income communities, right, who live and work closer to toxic facilities like petrochemical companies, which is a particularly acute challenge in Louisiana, as well as some other industrialized states. They reside in areas where there's more flooding. Of course, land use and zoning decisions are super important in that context. And so we think even inside of climate change about how important land use and zoning is. And they're receiving inadequate infrastructure supports. This is how we got the Katrina flooding, because the levees were not maintained at a level that they were supposed to. And so we think of a few ways about this. I'm on the Governor's Climate Task Force, as you mentioned earlier. And so we have a really updated approach to making sure that we engage people who are most impacted by all of these issues. And none of this will surprise any of the folks who helped sponsor this webinar or who are on the call. It's building people power, making sure that the civic infrastructure and capacity for people to participate and to influence the discussion is critically important. And that's long-term generational work that funders have to be allied with. Advancing just climate policy by creating equitable outcomes, again, through analysis, recommendations, and advocacy, not just resourcing the work with regard to how people organize and participate, but also resourcing the work that ensures policy is reflective of our findings from a justice and from a racial equity perspective, and the all-important work of cultivating new narratives. We are going to have to do what we've done in the past, whether it's been with public health campaigns or other approaches. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we've done this to great effect, and that is cultivating these new narratives that by using effective communication tools and market-based approaches and strategies to tell a different story about not only why we're in the middle of crisis and we have to respond now, but that we are going to have to bring people with us and to share that we actually do have strategies that can work both on the climate mitigation side, as well as the expansion of opportunities. And so the last thing I'll mention from this perspective is we're focused in 3 critical areas when communities ask us, but what are the answers? A few things matter, we think. One is economic opportunity. We've spoken to thousands of people in Louisiana, and we work with our colleagues across the Gulf Coast. People want to know how they can participate in this climate change and climate justice discussion in a way that benefits them and their families. And we're going to have a bulwark against industry who wants to continue to pursue an oil and gas approach, and economic opportunity in blue and green economies that mitigate the risk of climate change and expand economic opportunities for families is critically important. Number 2, environmental justice. We work toward democracy-driven and equitable solutions to environmental racism, and that is the evidence, and we've been able to map it. We have it by way of testimony, and we see it in the health outcomes of communities, most often Black and Indigenous and persons of color who live proximal to dangerous and poisonous spaces and places. That is a part of this critical climate justice and climate change conversation. And last, equitable development. It matters that we have a inclusive and vibrant and affordable communities and neighborhoods, and that we tie in high quality jobs, as I mentioned before, and economic opportunity to housing and land use and zoning, the environmental justice and safety issues, to what it means to develop equitable communities. All of these things people have shared with us, and the research tells us is critically important. We think these are lessons for philanthropy to track its investments and its building of relationships to ensure that we're investing in those ways.
Thanks, Lizelle. One last question, and then I want to move to our panel or to our Q&A. I'm seeing lots of really great questions come in. You've touched on this already, but what can funders do to help build alliances, especially with BIPOC communities or other allied communities in blue sky times?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. I think it's so important considering this moment that we're in. We know from experience that mining relationships and developing them where they don't exist with other funders is critically important. What we know from our experience is that there are many other funders who are immersed in racial and social justice practice, and space has to be made, especially in blue sky times, for us to connect with each other, to learn from each other, to understand from an operational perspective and get into the weeds. How are they doing that work? What does it look like? I'm so grateful for the sponsors of this webinar. I know we've been in absolute relationship with APFI and NCRP and Hispanics in Philanthropy and others to really be a part of those discussions and to share what we've learned here locally in national and international spaces and vice versa. We have created the Greater New Orleans Funders Network and Grantmakers for Southern Progress in this part of the country to specifically speak to these issues in the Deep South, because as many of us on the call know, regional appropriateness matters. What kind of disasters and what approaches work from one place to another are not often translational. And so we do want to honor the importance of place from that perspective. Honestly, Tanya, as a Black person leading a foundation, in some ways I feel like I have a bit of an advantage by way of my own experience in and with community. In addition to practices that we've developed to have an open engagement strategy with BIPOC people and organizations who are at the center of the work across the breadth of the strategies that I mentioned earlier. It's important to recognize that if you aren't already working with diverse and activist communities before disaster, it's a signal that you'll miss the opportunity to be in relationship with some of the most effective actors when it's most needed. That has been both proven by the research, and it also makes common sense from a values perspective. I think that's why it's important to target our grant offerings in BIPOC communities in particular as a way of understanding how the landscape is shaping and shifting and where there are opportunities to invest in the critically important work of pipeline development. And we think about that, by the way, at the individual as well as the organizational level. So there's a bit of shifting for some philanthropy and some organizations to reimagine their relationship with individuals, in addition to organizations and what that looks like. And we think we really think it's important to cultivate supports for Black and Indigenous and persons of color organizations who don't traditionally have donor bases and the kind of supports that their white-led neighbors do. And I want to put a pin in that. What we learned from Katrina and the BP oil disaster and everything else that we've done is that if you're going to do this racial equity work, and if you're going to really tackle structural racism, it means that your investment strategies are going to have to understand the history of inequitable investment in these people and their organizations, and how it's our duty as philanthropy to not only make up for that, but to ensure long-term success. I want to emphasize the importance of also actively inviting BIPOC and particularly trans and gender non-conforming folks into shared learning spaces to create relationships and trust. We know from experience that this is critically important. There are some real power dynamics that typically are hard for us to acknowledge, especially those of us who already do racial and social justice work. We believe sometimes that we are nearer to community than they perceive us to be. And so those things really need to be actively tended to. And, don't be afraid to get assistance from either experienced colleagues or consultants in the field who identify inside of these communities, not only as a way of building trust, but also as a way of making sure that your internal learning is commensurate with what you're actually trying to get done.
Thanks, Flozell. And you may have just opened yourself up to a steady flow of emails for advice and support. Yeah. I want to get some questions done. We only have about 7 minutes left. I'm going to do a lightning round for each panelist, one question. And this is the same question for everybody. So lightning round. Are there gaps in research that can help influence policy change? So Cassandra, as the academic, I'm going to start with you. Gaps in research that can help influence policy change. What would you love to see researched?
So the quick answer is yes, there are gaps. I think a point that both of the panelists made was really ensuring that oftentimes as academics, we can, and I will say we can be in a space where we feel like we are in our own academic bubble, and we think that we can just do research, fly in and fly out. Within my work, I purposely and intentionally work with, collaborate, have reciprocal relationships, are invested in communities. And so I ensure that the work that I do, that it first goes back to the community, we have a discussion, and then essentially we can decide what happens with it. So I think that without that bridge, it's pointless. I will say, just from a quick experience in working with schools, especially working in schools that are have been identified as low income, that are typically largely students of color, I have been told that I will get access, quote unquote, access to get into the schools, but no other academic can, because it turns out to be a very violent space, a very violent idea to just go in and take and not foster and not establish a relationship. So there was a quick thing that I will say really quickly, a point that President Daniels made, where he talked about, I think it was like this individualistic perspective and urgency. And that really stems from this idea of white supremacy culture, that there are certain things that we have within our culture that we do, and we don't recognize that having a very individualistic perspective, or even having this sense of urgency, that eliminates communal spaces for people to gather, to a democracy, to discuss, to seek out other perspectives that are not actively or presently engaged. And so really kind of pushing myself, really kind of calling out the things that, especially that the academy fosters, absolutely fosters that white supremacy, the culture, but then ensuring that whenever working with communities and working with socially marginalized communities, that I am able, and that a team, we're able to recognize these things, call these things out when they need to be called out, and then move forward. So my answer is yes, absolutely to that question, but that also kind of the biggest thing is building a trusting bridge, a bridge of trust. And that involves, unfortunately, a lot of hard work. So I guess if you're not willing to do the work, don't even try to build a bridge, not to be crass.
No, I totally get that. Carla, let's go to you. What would you like to see research for policy change?
Absolutely. I agree with Dr. Cassandra. I definitely feel that the co-design of a lot of the work that we are doing also, and I'm so glad to hear that Dr. Cassandra and Flossel are doing this type of work in co-design with community. I'm starting to see more academics head that direction. And a lot of the great stuff that's happening because of capacity of being able to retain and analyze that data and really trend that is very difficult. And to really find the points of leveraging, be able to package them and then replicate them and share them with other communities and peer learning. So I would encourage that we capture what's coming out of these new collaborations between academia and community, particularly when it comes to civic engagement. But when it comes to research in advocacy, and I'm sorry, I'm a data person. I've never really liked collecting the data. I love analyzing data. And I really feel that we did such a hard work, and this was the reason why I worked for the Census Bureau and the outreach. We were really concerned about getting the dollars, getting the people counted and getting the political representation. The work that comes after the count, as the numbers start coming back, is crucial. There's no reason to count so many people if you're not going to get the right funding and the fair representation that you have. But where I would like to see the research and the growth is in making data not just equitable in the acquisition of it, but also in the access to analyzing it. And what I mean by that is the Census Bureau is not well suited, or has not really invested in making data available in a way where it's visual. Visualization, right, for me, has been one of the best tools that we have for communities to be able to interact with their own data and understand and think critically about their community. So I would encourage, because I know this is a lightning round and we're running out of time, I would encourage that we do data availability and access and digestible for communities. That would be great.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, Flozell, I'm going to have to skip you. But we have some great questions, and we will do some follow-up with our panelists and with the questions for everyone. So we are out of time. I want to just share some quick takeaways that I think really summarize the discussion we've had today. So philanthropists need to embed an equitable disaster recovery framework into their grant making. We need to think about racial and intersectional equity in the context of disaster recovery. Philanthropy should be relational, not transactional. Really encourage you to read the book Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva from the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina, if you haven't. Black, Indigenous, people of color communities must be prioritized, and you've heard about the centuries of racial discrimination and systemic inequitable policies that have allowed them to, resulted in them having differential impacts. This work cannot be done in isolation, and root causes need to be addressed. Can't blame people, we can't blame communities, we have to look at systems. And you need to build networks and connections in advance of a disaster, and everyone talked about the ways in which we can do that. Think about the blue sky times, because we know the disaster isn't a question of if, it's when the next one is. CDP has a number of resources that we encourage you to check out. You can look at our website at disasterphilanthropy.org to see the various resources that are available for funders. If you're thinking about doing disaster response funding, we also have a disaster philanthropy playbook, which is at disasterplaybook.org. And then our next webinar is June 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and it's a COVID-19 checkup, looking at response and recovery 18 months after the first case and 6 months after the first vaccine. So thank you to everyone. This is all the time we have. Thank you to Cassandra, Carla, and Flozell, especially for taking time to share their insights with us. Special thanks to our co-sponsors, Asse, Change Philanthropy, National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, Native Americans in Philanthropy, the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, and the United Philanthropy Forum. If you have any questions that were not addressed today, you can email me at tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.